Okay, well, I'm good to go. Welcome. Thanks for being here. Like the program says, this is a session about multilingual content, managing multilingual content in D7. I'm Bull Weber from Lingotech, and I'm having trouble advancing my slides. Here we go. There we go. So the agenda for today, we'll talk a little bit about Lingotech just so you sort of have a context for what it is that we do. But we've got great news. There's a great solution for managing content within Drupal, multilingual content, getting it translated, keeping content across multiple languages synchronized. So I'm going to walk through kind of the high-level overview of that, how it works, what the problem is it solves. And then, as I was saying earlier, I'm not a developer, so I'm going to attempt to show you what it's like to install a module and initially configure a few different workflows. I am going to do that with screenshots, so hopefully it'll be compelling. Hi, no problem. Welcome. Whoops. Thank you guys for coming. Appreciate it. So, a little background on Lingotech. We're an 8-year-old software company, SaaS software company. Been working in the Drupal community for not quite 2 years. What our focus is a cloud-based translation management system that makes it possible to keep multilingual content synchronized across myriad different content repositories. Today we're going to talk about Drupal. We have a deep integration into Drupal with our Contrib module. We're really excited that we're approaching 15,000 downloads. We're at something like 14,957 or something. Just under 250 sites reporting. We're in a couple of notable distros that you might recognize, like Aqua Commons. We're a founding member of their Partner Alliance program. Standing next to the software company, or internally anyway, we have an internal professional translation agency, because lots of times clients that are using the software to keep everything in sync, they need professional translation services because obviously machine translation isn't good enough. So if they don't have the internal resources available, multilingual employees or whatever, which a lot of large worldwide companies have marketing teams in different countries, they can very easily have Lingotech do professional translation work for them. Sorry, there we go. So a way to think of us for purposes of Drupal is there's the TMS in the cloud in the middle, the translation management system. It's connected up to Drupal. A deep integration through our Contrib module, and then there are great professional translators down there at the bottom. With that said, as I said earlier, it's a cloud-based system. We do obviously have a deep integration into Drupal, but that's not the only repository that we integrate into. So for most of your clients that are large enterprises, they may be running their public-facing website on Drupal, but I guarantee you they'll have other systems that they're using for different things. They'll certainly have lots of documents that they need to translate. They may be using software localization things. They may be using something like Marketo for marketing automation. Maybe they'll have an internal extranet that's running on SharePoint. So a key concept for Lingotech is that you can have a singular book of record for all multilingual content that lives in the cloud, and it can propagate out across all of their other properties and resources and repositories where content lives. So as an example, if you think about a press release, how it always at the bottom has that boilerplate kind of about the company, say, if that needs to change, that content is going to need to live in a lot of places. It's going to need to live in PDF versions of the press release. It's going to need to live on the website, wherever that little about the company is listed. It's going to need to live in a bunch of different places. To the extent it costs money, or it definitely costs time, to get a change like that translated into all the other languages, you only have to pay to do that once. The typical sort of configuration in the past is that organizations are deployed or are managed departmentally. So you'll have the marketing people paying for their translation. You'll have the product development people paying to manage their translation. This way, you can have everything live in one singular place and propagate out to the other platforms. If you've got if you've got a custom application or something we don't already have an integration for, we have a very substantial multilingual API that you can use to make your own calls, quickly register, and then make your own calls. to make any application multilingual. I would encourage you to check that out if you want to just play with it. Quick snapshot of some of our customers. As you can see, I was talking about how cool Drupal is in terms of the Drupal community's willingness to try new things. Software companies generally are like that, so you can see that we have a kind of preponderance of software companies. We're beginning to branch out. We're excited about, for example, Princess Cruises. These are ones that are specific to Drupal. We do a lot of work with partner agencies. The Promet Source people are here. They're a partner of ours. These are some others, just to give you a little bit of a sense. So let's get to it. This is basically what Lingotech is about. Websites these days, content is super dynamic. It changes literally on a daily basis. For large enterprises, there are significant changes. And the issue is that processes that they have in place aren't rapid and agile enough to keep up. The typical legacy process involves emailing or FTPing Word documents to an agency, waiting a couple of weeks, traditional translation agency, having no visibility into the status of the project, and then it all comes back to Word documents. And then what are they doing? They're copying and pasting into web pages. They're breaking HTML markup. They're not knowing where the formatting around the copy was, the bolds and the italics and things like that. So it's a nightmare process. And with the speed and rate of change today, the legacy process just isn't able to keep up. So a way to depict that is like this. I will not read all these boxes, I promise, but a typical process for translating web content involves some or most of these steps, right? It's different in each case, but in most, it's basically identifying content that needs to be translated, extracting it from the website, packaging it up somehow, sending it off somewhere to be translated, getting it back, taking it through some sort of a review, and then somehow copying and pasting it into the website and fixing the links and all that stuff. And if you think about it, a translation agency, they basically help with this step, right? The one step. You send them stuff, they will translate it for you and send it back. But all of the other things are the enterprise's responsibility. And when you begin to multiply these things by the number of additional languages they have deployed, the number of pages on the website, all of these other variables in the process, the thing just grows exponentially and eventually becomes just completely unmanageable. And the reason for that is that they just don't have the cycles to keep up. This stuff's changing so often. And the reason that it's such an overwhelming process is because it's way, way too manual, not enough automation. So what Lingotech does is we provide a platform and a system for making it possible to manage all those changes. The big keys to it are using technology for change discovery, having a system in place that automatically recognizes changes or new content, and automating the workflows. So all of those macro manual steps in the process, where in the past it'd literally be in the in the dev environment and they'd be copying and pasting content out and sending it off to be translated. Those sorts of steps are all completely automated. So here's a good way to look at it schematically with respect to Drupal. There's the Drupal website up at the top. New content, changed content, automatically pushed up to the cloud. And then up there, whatever needs to happen to it to get it translated the way the client wants occurs, and then it comes right back down to Drupal. For most enterprises, it's sort of a mix of types of translation. We call this thing the content value index. You would never use machines to translate your whole website or really any important document because the quality just is not good enough. But machine translation has its place, right? It's a good thing to use for social comments or article comments, things that by definition are not the enterprise's input, but they're social inputs. And there's some real value in translating those quickly. Like for one thing, I like to read the comments below articles in like the New York Times or whatever, and I can tell from the kind of clumsy syntax when it wasn't somebody writing in English. But the article is very timely about some news event, and it's really interesting to hear what some guy in China who read the article typed in Chinese as a comment, and it's rendered for me in English. So there's a place for machine translation to automatically machine translate. Another example is like a product forum where it's customers of the company asking each other questions. It makes it a lot more effective if everybody's multilingual. If the website's deployed in 15 languages, somebody asks a question in one language, the entire audience of all those 15 languages sees the question in their language, and they can respond in their language, and it gets translated back. So there are use cases for automatic. Another one is a popular workflow these days is to have changed content get machine translated and then get a review by a person internally. So it takes less time to fix machine translation, to edit it, than it does to do it from scratch. Community is kind of a catch-all term that we use. It basically means human translation by people other than professionals. And that gets back to the example I was talking about before, where in the case of a very large company, they might have offices in 15 or 20 different countries. They might have marketing teams in each of those countries. So a workflow can be set up where whenever there's a change, the system sends an email out to a specific individual or to a group in each of the countries that's responsible for each of the languages. That has a link in it. They click the link. It spins up the translation workbench. They do the translations. They save them, and it comes back down to the website. So anytime there are internal resources, internal humans, multilingual employees that can do the translation, that's what we refer to as community. And then professional, of course, is companies will always use professional translation agencies for their really important stuff, their most important marketing stuff that requires the most highly nuanced localization. So those are kind of the three legs of the stool. The cool thing is you can blend them together. So with each new client that we take on board, we take a look at all of the resources that they have available to them for translating content, and they're all a little bit different. We can rope in all of the assets they have and leverage them so that to the extent they need professional translation, they don't, they're not using that more than they have to, because that's, of course, the most expensive way to translate stuff. So getting back to our boxes here, basically what we're doing, red means manual and blue means automated. And there we are sitting there with the only automated step in our traditional process being the translation agency completing the translation. We're basically, by installing the module, we're turning all these other boxes blue. Each of these steps occurs, but by virtue of the Drupal module and the TMS, they're all automated. So you have just as much control as you do before. Sometimes that's a concern folks have, is that they're going to lose control of the process because it goes so quickly. It's not true. You have great visibility into the processes. But they're automated. You just don't have to execute them manually. It eliminates all of the mistakes that happen, when manual processes are used for, copying and pasting and things like that. And it provides more control. So before we get into what it looks like to install the module, etc., any questions about any of that? Does this seem relevant to what you were kind of hoping you might find out? Yes, no, maybe, a little, kind of? I know it's late. A few more minutes and we can get to that first cocktail. Okay, so a quick tour, and I'm going to sit down and read this. Like I said, I'm not a developer. I've got a series of screenshots that sort of depict downloading and installing the module and doing a couple of different configurations. So in this first, we're just basically going to download the module, configure it to machine translate some content, and just basically round trip it through the TMS. So basically, go out to Drupal.org or anywhere else, find the latest version of our module, install it, enable it, etc. Figure out what content types you're going to translate. There's a step where you configure, or you basically provision a SaaS instance of the platform to connect the module to, so that you can pass stuff up, back and forth. That's a simple process. Pick your source language. Pick the type of language switching you're going to do. This is kind of a rudimentary example where you're just kind of deciding where to place a language switcher on the page. You can do other things that are more sophisticated. Set up a script that recognizes, for example, the language configuration of the browser and automatically serves that. But for this example, we're using a switcher. Figure out which types of content you want to translate. The system will translate basically everything other than images. And in the case of images, we can set up a professional services process to do that. But articles, blocks, taxonomies, menus, all internal UI elements, all of those things can be translated if they've been properly prepared. They all need to be wrapped in the T function, all that good stuff. So you make those settings, and then you basically, from a selection list, you decide what languages you want to translate the site into. In this case, we're going to do Spanish. There's also a step where you decide whether or not changes are going to be automatically uploaded and automatically downloaded. In the case of professional translation, sometimes since there's a direct cost associated with that, folks like to throttle that and let enough content build up that needs to be translated before they professionally translate. So they like to control that process. But basically, you make those settings. You can see that the settings have been made here and that it exists here. If we send some content up to Lingotech within Drupal, there's a progress bar. And in the case of professional translation, it happens almost immediately. There are a dozen or so machine translation engines there that we pay the licensing for. So even if you don't become a Lingotech client, you're certainly welcome to install the module and round trip some content up and back to machine translation. Great step, sort of an audit step if you're planning multilingual content and you want to, for example, see what's going to happen to the design if we deploy in Arabic and everything's right justified. What's that going to look like? Even if the quality of the translations isn't very good, you'll be able to see what happens to the design when you do that to it. Or another example is German has these large, complex nouns, so they're notorious for breaking navigational elements when you just clumsily machine translate. So you can identify the things that you're going to need to address by doing that. So if you have clients that are that are thinking about deploying other languages and stuff, and you've been tasked with figuring that out, that's a step that you can do absolutely for free. Install the module and just translate the whole site with machines to see what it's going to look like, and it'll help you identify some of the key issues. So getting back to our example here, this is the page that we just round-tripped. Here it is in English. There it is in Spanish. Very simple process. Whoops. Sorry about that. Windows 8, I'm still not used to it. So anyway, that's a very simple round-tripping of machine translation. There we go. So another step is internal translation is another way to say community translation, but this is basically a workflow wherein individuals internally at the company are doing the translation rather than machines. So basically, what you do in this case is change the workflow configuration. We call them translation profiles. But down here on the configuration page down there at the bottom, you can see the workflow is set to machine translation. So we'll change that to a custom one that we created called internal translation. So what that means is that when content changes or new content is added, it goes up to the TMS, and then the project manager who has control of what happens to it next. That's the person that sets up, that indicates who's going to be responsible for translating what, and it just sort of manages all of those configurations and can see over here, what progress has been made on each of those translations, maybe ping the people involved if that's required. So they have this complete project management suite that they can do that, to control who translates what and to track what's going on with those translations. This is the translator workbench that an actual translator uses, and it'll show the source content, it'll show the target content. That'll be pre-populated if the translation memory vault has previous translations that match. The system will show that. It also shows if there are partial matches, and it just basically shows the delta that needs to be translated. So these are all tools that someone who does translation will be familiar with from other tools that they've worked with. They're kind of industry standard. But they essentially get an email like this that alerts them whenever there's content for them to translate. They click a link, they spin up the workbench, they complete the translation, and then it can be sent back down to the website. This is the project management suite that now shows on the right there that everything's at 100%. And so now everything's ready to download back to the website. That's a step that can happen automatically, by the way. But this is just, I'm trying to show where those things get configured. So back to Drupal, the person managing the website can see that the translation is 100% complete. so they can download it or they can edit it further if they want, publish it right back out to the site, and it's good to go. So that's a very quick example, but if you think about all the different possibilities there are for that type of translation, principal one being a pass of machine translation followed by a review by somebody internally, makes the process much quicker, much less expensive. And again, all of the steps associated with moving content around physically, copying and pasting and emailing and FTPing, and all those things are eliminated. Stuff that needs to be changed is placed in front of the person that's going to translate it automatically and easily, and when the translation's done, it's reinserted into Drupal with all of its formatting and all of its markup put back in place. So the last step is a simpler one. I'm just going to quickly show if you were setting things up for professional translation, which, as we talked about before, certain types of content that'll be appropriate for basically the top tier, most nuanced stuff. Before I do that, any questions to this point?
I have a lot of questions, actually.
Okay.
I'm wondering how this all happens, and my reason for asking is, is all of the content for a web page in English and in Spanish once this conversion is done, and then it just depends on what the selection is, whether they see it in English or Spanish, or is it a second page and it's a whole, and because that'll depend on, I'm thinking about storage and server space, how quickly, and then also some of the content may be alt tags because our site needs to be accessible to readers, and how does that come into this? Will it see it in Spanish, for example? I mean,
sure. Well,
that stuff?
Sure. I mean, both of those questions. Starting with the first one, it does exist in both languages, and it does exist in Drupal. It comes back down, so there is that. That's generally thought of as a benefit. But I guess from what you're saying, if it were for an enormous site, you could conceivably run into storage constraints, I suppose.
So is it a separate document or page or node, or is it just all together?
Well, it's all together, but it's segmented. It's technically segmented, so only the right stuff gets served up.
Okay.
But it is all there. You know how Drupal's moving from node-based to entity-based? That's what's connecting it all together. In the node-based world, it is separate nodes, and it serves up the right one. In the entity-based world, it's more of a blend. But like I said before, I'm not a developer, but my understanding is that's generally regarded as a good thing.
And you were saying that whatever their browser preferences set is how it will display when they come.
Well, there are a few ways to determine that. You can also put a language selector, a language switcher in the design, and in that case, it will just show whatever their selector is set on, or you can have the browser detection thing work. What was the second question again?
Second was, let's say that my site has to be accessible, so there are readers for blind users that are scanning the site. So when that content, like you had mentioned, if I understand it correctly, I have my page published, I made a change, that change goes up, and the change was that I had a graphic on the page and I have alt text that's describing the graphic. I mean, is that detected, and do you know when that's pushed up that that's what I want translated? Do your translators see that stuff?
Yeah, I mean, anything associated, anything on the page is visible. And
because the alt tags that describe the picture are not viewable to you or me, but they are to a reader.
now that you mention it, that's actually a question I don't know the answer to. It's a good question, because one of the points that I make is that what happens when content gets changed is all of the markup gets stripped from it so that it doesn't get accidentally translated. And just the copy goes up there, it gets translated, and then as it comes back down, all of that is reinserted. So the question becomes, what if you want to translate the alt tags? wouldn't they be removed with all the other markup and not subject to the translation workflow that you've set up, right? I don't know. That's a good question. I'm sure there's a way that that gets handled. I mean, I'm sure that happens with, you know, with Cisco and eBay and all these companies that we work with. I just don't know specifically what the process is for that. If you want me to, I can follow up with you, but I'm going to find out anyway because I should know that. I don't know what it is, but I'm sure that it's handled appropriately in some way. It could be that alt tags are a specific you know, content type that is specifically looked for, because that actually does need to be changed, because at the end of the day, it is user content, right? Because end users, you know, hover their mouse over it, or if they have a reader of some sort, that content needs to be translated. It can't, like the reader can't say the word in English if the person's, you know, looking at the site or listening to the site in Italian. So I would imagine that they get, you know, that's a specific, you know, thing that has to happen. That's a part of the part of what gets detected and what gets sent up. You know, maybe alt tags are excluded from what's removed from the page. But it's conjecture. I don't want to waste your time. But I'll find that out. If you want to give me a card or something, I'll email you about that. I can probably find out, you know, during the day tomorrow from one of my sales engineers what the answer is. Do you want to continue along and then do more questions, or are there more questions now to you guys? I just have, you know, one last little workflow, which is the professional translation one, and then I think a case study, and we can continue to talk. I mean, we're totally good on time. So should I just go through these last couple of, okay. So this is a page that's going to be for professional translation. So again, on the configuration page, you would change the setting to indicate that it's going to be a professional translation piece. This is what the page looks like in English. So essentially, you designate that it needs to be professionally translated, and then basically within Google, there's a way to watch these dashboards and see progress, so that you can predict when the job's going to be completed. Up in the TMS, you would have set it up so that when this particular type of content, or when this particular workflow is utilized and content is attached to it and sent up, then it goes through a process at Lingotech where a professional translator does the translation, uses that same workbench that I was showing before, so their work, their leverage translation memories and glossary assets and other things. And then a second linguist does a review. The process goes very quickly, and then within Drupal managing the site, you can see what percentage of the work is done. So this is what it looks like as it's sort of in progress. There's a dashboard that will show you basically what's in sync and what's out of sync. I guess the color scheme is not completely intuitive, but blue means that these languages, this page, in these languages are completely in sync with the source language. Red means that it's out of sync. So when there's red stuff there, when you're doing professional translation, like I said before, most folks don't like it to automatically be sent up to the TMS. Green means that there are completed translations that need to be downloaded. So once it gets downloaded, you'll see that once it's green, that means that the translation work is completed. I'm sorry. Then you download it. And when everything's blue, everything's good. So looking at it in different languages, just as an example, working through the language switcher, that's what it would look like. It's a very simple process, but you set up, and I don't have it in this deck, but you go into the TMS and you set up the particular languages that you're going to need professional translation for, and there's a way that when you send stuff up, the system will send up a quote, and then you can basically click proceed, and it'll be done professionally, and it'll then come back down. I talked a little bit earlier about hybrid workflows. You don't have to do machine or internal people or professional translation. You can blend them together. For example, you can set up a process or a workflow where content is professionally translated, and then the next step is your internal marketing people in the different countries get pinged with an alert to spin up the platform and just review those professional translations. There may be nuances to to fully localize them based on the local culture, so that's a popular one. I mentioned machine translation plus internal review. That's another one that's popular as well because it's a pretty inexpensive way to get good quality. Or you could do machines and have professionals review and edit them. You can use crowdsourcing. You know, it's kind of an unusual use case, but you know, on Wikipedia, when you see an article sometimes and it says this article needs citation, or you could contribute to this article, there's a way to, you know, to check a box and have pages appear, you know, have a particular page appear to the public with a little thing on the top like that. It would help us work on the translations of this page. You know, if you're multilingual and people can literally, visitors can do the translation themselves. Sometimes that's deployed completely in the open, and other times that's deployed in a kind of an online community situation where people know that they've logged in and they're leaving footprints, so they'll do a better job. But crowdsourcing can be useful in some use cases, depending upon the type of content. You know, doing crowdsourcing and having internal people review it before it goes live, or professionals. Sometimes you have internal people at the corporate level do translation, in the case of a big worldwide company, and then internal people in the individual countries that the content is intended for, who are also internal folks, will review and further localize it, and then it'll be completed. So lastly, just a quick case study. Client of ours, Alfresco. There's a lot of page views, a lot of customers, content deployed in a lot of marketplaces. They've been working traditionally with you know, with SDL or LineBridge, one of these big translation agencies, and they were really struggling to keep up. So they installed the Lingotech module, and they're basically using that to sync content out across different languages, and it's been extremely effective for them. They're a very happy client, and they use a blend of our professional translation and internal resources, because they have, you know, they're a company with thousands and thousands of people around the world, so they have a lot of multilingual employees, particularly in Europe. So they do some of their own translation work as well. But you know, the process was completely swamped before because they were still trying to manage it manually, and we were able to get them out of that mess. There are some additional case studies that you can look at if you want on the website. Each of them is kind of different or unique in its own way. As I mentioned before, totally would encourage you to download the module and just play with it in some sort of a dev environment. And if you want to get in touch with me and have me put one of my sales engineers or solutions engineers in touch with you to spin up a GoToMeeting and do that together with you, happy to do that, but it doesn't cost anything to use the module, and you can machine translate if you want to see what different content, you know, different web spaces and other things would look like with translated content. So that's the end of my deck, but I'm happy to answer questions and would love to hear about any projects that you're working on, and you know, schedule any kind of a follow-up to talk more about them. Anything that didn't make sense to anyone, or any questions that you thought of along the way? Happy to answer them. Just the two? What do you think? Was anything confusing about that? I feel like it was kind of a rambling monologue, and curious if I lost anybody.
I would ask, if you were to use, say, the crowdsourcing idea, you can moderate that still. You wouldn't just leave that, have somebody just suddenly put stuff out there that actually very wrong.
Right.
Or very insulting.
Mm-hmm.
You know, I guess, how does that, is there a moderation on that?
Sure. When you set up, technically there doesn't have to be. You could set up a workflow that would simply allow anybody to translate this. But remember, the translation's happening in the TMS in the cloud, so there's always going to be that air gap between that and Drupal. So as content comes back down, even if you had no one review it after it was translated, you could review it in Drupal before you inserted it onto the website. But the pretty standard scenario is that it is moderated, so you build a workflow that invites people to do the translation, but any translating that gets done, there's a subsequent step in the workflow where somebody who speaks that language that's internal reviews it and you know, make sure it's either high enough quality or there's nothing, you know, obscene about it, can edit it and then approve it. So somebody internally would own that and be the gatekeeper.
So for the most part, what you're suggesting with this Lingotech solution is that this is not an instant submit this through Lingotech to get the Spanish version.
Correct. Correct.
It comes back, and then we can use that Spanish.
Exactly. I
So
mean,
my understanding, though, is that you would just create your content, publish your content to your website, and then the tools are already in place that are going to push it to Lingotech. You aren't manually pushing it to Lingotech.
well, in the case of each workflow, there's a box you can check that says automatically send changes to Lingotech, and if you uncheck it, they'll get detected, and then you can do it manually. Most folks, for machine or internal translation, they check that box so that automatically any changes get sent, because there's no cost associated with that. With professional translation, they sometimes don't check that box because they know that it's literally going to generate a PO. They like to let it build up to a certain level, and then they'll send it. So then they'll then they'll manually send it.
And how are your fees determined? Is it based on, size of site or actual work done?
Well, there are two components. The SaaS software license for the TMS is priced based on it's per target language. So it's $5,000 per target language. So a typical client, that goes to Europe, say they're adding 4 or 5 languages. It's 25,000 or something a year. It doesn't matter the volume at all that they move through the system. Unlimited machine translation, unlimited number of seats for any internal people that they want to have using the platform to do translation. Covers all that, except professional translation services work. That's done by our translation agency. Industry standard for that is it's priced per word. So when stuff gets sent for professional translation, then we spin up a quote, on a project basis for those things. And pricing for that, industry standard is, for like the European languages, it's typically, anywhere from 9 to 18 cents per word, depending upon which language it is. And also that there are other aspects to it, like if subject matter expertise is required, if it's legal stuff or medical stuff, or it's about aeronautics or whatever, we have to vet the appropriate translators that, we have some rules. They have to have advanced degrees. They have to be translating into their native tongue. But if they need to have expertise in a particular industry or discipline, then we have to factor that in as well. That makes it a little bit higher. But basically, just to get to your question, the SaaS license is one component. That's an annual thing. And then professional translation is quoted on a project basis. And we can, with larger clients, we can work with an open PO or something and just invoice against it, or however they want to manage that piece. Anything else? Everybody ready for a beer or a glass of wine? I know I am. I had just an insane travel day yesterday, starting with getting to the airport at 11 for my 1:30 flight and finding out I was actually booked on the 5:40 flight. So I was like, 6 hours in Salt Lake City, huh? And the next thing was the kiosk sold me a $50 one-day pass to the American Airlines Admiral Club. And I went through security and went upstairs to where the American Airlines gates are, and guess what? There is no American Airlines Admiral Club in Salt Lake City. And the kiosk sold me a pass for it. I paid for it. I couldn't believe it. So it went on and on from there, but I won't bore you with the details. But it was like 2:30 in the morning when I got here last night. So, but thank you for coming. Thanks for your interest.